I chose a reading this morning from the book of Isaiah, and it's one of the few references in the Hebrew scriptures that can be actually authenticated historically by giving the exact date that it happened. So this vision that Isaiah had in the temple, the first temple, which had been built by Solomon about the year 950 BCE, he has this vision in 742 BCE. And we know this precisely because he mentions the death of King Uzziah. And the death of King Uzziah, who was the king of Israel at the time, is mentioned in the Assyrian history as well. The Assyrians were the great empire of the time. And so he has this vision in 742 BCE. And exactly 22 years later, the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, would be destroyed by the great Assyrian empire. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne. And the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings, they covered their faces. With 2, they covered their feet. And with 2, they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it, he touched my mouth and said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, here I am, send me. These are words inspired by God. Everybody has an internal GPS indicating how we think and act and speak. The problem is that this internal data, these internal data, are unconsciously acquired from teachers and authority figures of various kinds. And you put us in any one situation and they're unconsciously accessed. So we're being driven by forces we don't understand and we haven't brought to full consciousness. And hence the great teachers will constantly remind us that the very first virtue is coming awake. You can't actually love anything unless you're awake. What passes for love, if you're unconscious, is mere, mawkish sentimentality. In order to love, you first have to be awake. And the more fully you're awake, the more fully you can love. And so the Buddha would say about 550 BCE, his name was Gautama Siddhartha. He called himself Buddha. He said, I am Buddha, which literally means I am awake. And Socrates would say very famously, the unexamined life is not worth living. And Jesus would say, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he wouldn't go to sleep. So we have to be awake before we can love. Now, for the month of March, I took as my theme the notion of creating your own personal cosmology. And I suggested that in order to create your own personal cosmology or your own internal GPS system, it's based on 4 primary questions. The skeleton of your cosmology is these 4 questions. And when you kind of work with these 4 questions, then you begin to flesh it out and build out an entire body of knowledge and guidance. And the 4 questions I suggest are, who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? And so I'm going to do a recap today. It's the 3rd Sunday of addressing this topic. So I'm going to do a recap of the other 2 previous homilies and then open it up to a Q&A. So I want to start again with an image I've used many times. Imagine you have a 4 or 5-year-old child and you have just bought a jigsaw puzzle, a big puzzle that you intend working on yourself, maybe 5,000 pieces. And you left it on the kitchen table and you're out in the garden working and your child discovers the puzzle tears it asunder, and scatters pieces all over the house. And to make matters worse, your dog has found the cornflakes box and he's shredding it. And there are pieces of the cornflakes box mixed in with the jigsaw puzzle. And you arrive in, and now there's this mess all over the house, in the bathroom, the kitchen, the dining room, everywhere, just pieces of cardboard. Now, to assemble a jigsaw puzzle, you need to do three things. The first thing is you got to gather all of the pieces of cardboard. You don't know whether they're jigsaw or a cornflakes box. You got to gather all of them first, because at the back, they all look the same. So gathering all the pieces, gathering all your data is called, in philosophy, is called epistemology. How do we know what we know? And so it's about gathering information. And there are several ways in which we know what we know. An authority figure told us, or we had an experience for ourselves, or we figure stuff out on our own. So first, you have to gather the data, gather up all of the pieces. The second thing is, you now have to sort out the real jigsaw puzzle pieces from the pieces of the cardboard box, from the cornflakes. And in philosophy, that's called ontology. How do you separate out truth from falsehood? Faced with any proposition, how do you decide whether to believe in it or not believe in it? And so you've now reduced all the pieces down to the pieces you believe actually belong to the jigsaw puzzle. And then the third piece is, now you've got to assemble the jigsaw puzzle. And philosophy calls this cosmology. Cosmology is how you assemble the pieces. First, you have to gather them, epistemology. Then you have to sort the good ones from the bad ones, ontology. And then you have to fashion the jigsaw puzzle, which is the cosmology. Now, when you said about, creating your personal cosmology and you're putting the pieces together, the finished product has to be much, much bigger than mere ethics or religion. A cosmology is not just telling you how to behave ethically in the world or what you believe, in your religious teaching. It must be much, much bigger than that. Your cosmology, if it is to serve you properly, it has to be able to account for mysticism, explain mysticism to you. It must be able to teach you about every facet of life, before you incarnated, during your incarnation, after your incarnation, and during your reincarnation. It should be able to kind of give you ideas about all these facets of the single life that courses through all of creation. And it must be able to account, even if you don't believe in them, it has to be able to take account of the existence of stuff like extraterrestrials or extra-dimensionals or angels or demons. It has to give you the ability to kind of wrestle with these notions, whether you believe in them or you don't believe in them, but your cosmology has to be able to wrestle with these possibilities. Now, as you're developing your cosmology then, what are some of the kind of the tricks of the trade? How do you figure out what do you choose to believe in and of what pieces you choose to assemble your puzzle? So I told you that during my 14 years in Kenya, living in very remote areas where, right on the equator, the sun went down at 6 o'clock every night pretty much and got up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Everybody in the village went to bed at sundown. And there was no way, as being Irish, I was going to go to bed at 6 o'clock. So I spent a lot of my night times with candles burning on my little table, trying to figure out my own kind of personal cosmology. And so I did an archaeological dig on all of the tenets of my belief system, having been raised Catholic and Irish. And I went through them one by one to try to separate out the tenets of my belief system into what I could really hold on to and ones I could let go of. I wanted to be able to separate real truth from mere cultural belief systems. I wanted to hospice the old cosmology and say, Kwaheri, Kwanana, goodbye until we meet again. And I wanted to be able to midwife the new cosmology. And so, as for examples, some of the stuff I rejected and threw into the I don't believe anymore bucket would have been papal infallibility, birth control, that women can't be priests, limbo, purgatory, and hell. I rejected these notions out of hand as kind of having nothing got to do with deep spirituality. And I began to keep stuff like the golden rule or forgiving the enemy that I found in all the great wisdom traditions. So that was the first part of the exercise for me, separating out my belief systems into two buckets, what I continue to believe in and what I can no longer believe in. Now, part of that journey for me then was to try to trace for myself, who is God? This was the answer to the first question. Because I was raised, obviously, as an Irish Catholic, fearful of God and fearful of hell, and punishment, that the best I could hope for was purgatory, and maybe after, 17,000 years of burning nonstop, somebody would release me. So I needed to kind of figure out what did I really believe about who God was. And the first thing I looked at the kind of the language of God that I found in many of the great spiritual traditions. And I realized that theologians use a language which is called cataphatic language, a Greek term, which means kind of trying to dissect who God is and what God had for breakfast and how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And it's total mishigas. It's totally made up. It leads to all kinds of controversies and all kinds of fights between, for instance, the Greek Orthodox Church and Roman Catholicism on the basis of a single word, filioque, and of the Son. I talked about that in detail. And then I discovered there's another kind of language, when you're treating of God, and that's called, in Greek, it's called apophatic language. It's the language of the mystics. Lao Tzu would say famously, those who say don't know, and those who know don't say. That's the language he's talking about. Hindus will talk about neti, not this, not that. X, no, God is not X. Y, no, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. And Zen Buddhism will present the koan. It'll say to you stuff like, what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born? There's no logical answer to that. So they're trying to back you out of your intellect and into your soul self. And Meister Eckhart would say, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. And Gautama Siddhartha, the Buddhist would say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. In other words, a theological language can't get you there. You need apophatic language. And I suggested that the only kind of exception is that when somebody needs to be a teacher, like a Jesus figure, and they need to try to articulate, the experience of the divine, then they'll use parable and metaphor and story and proverb. They won't ever resort to philosophical treatises or scientific language or theological compendia. And so we have that in order to kind of wrestle with the notion of God, we have to firstly learn a very different kind of language. I call this language, actually, I call it mythish, the language of teachers. Mythish, the ability to speak in myth and parable, metaphor and story. Now, as we've wrestled then with this notion of God over the last 70,000 years, because Homo sapiens, who evolved about 200,000 years ago, did not have language. That only arrived 70,000 years ago with Homo sapiens sapiens. And I think the first use to which we put, language was storytelling. And the first great stories were wrestling with the great existential questions. Who made all of this? Where did we come from? Why is it so painful? Where do we go when we die? And so in this trajectory, I suggest we invented three very different kinds of gods. The first kind of gods we created, I would call them regional gods. It's like the local mafia. You moved into a particular piece of real estate or a particular part of the world. There was a god who was in charge of that location, and you had to pay homage to that particular god. Otherwise, they'd be held to pay. He was basically kind of a mafia don in a particular location. That was one kind of god. A second kind of god I would call tribal gods. And these were gods who followed particular nomadic tribes. Wherever the tribe went, he went with them. Or sometimes he led the way and they followed him. Like in the story of the Exodus, this God appeared as a pillar of cloud during the day and fire during the night. And they followed that wherever it went. So this second kind of God is a nomadic divinity. And then you had a third kind of God that I call portfolio gods. If you were interested in war, here's the God you needed to follow. Mars, for instance, if you were Roman. If you were interested in art, here's the God you needed to follow. If you were interested in sex, here's the God you needed to follow. If you were interested in agriculture, here's the guy who was really good at agriculture. And so there were very, very different kinds of gods. And then, our relationship then went through, I believe, 4 or 5 great stages. The first one I call the era of the theologians. So at this stage, people are talking about the gods, and there are multiple divinities at this stage. They're talking, who are they? Where do they live? What do they eat? The second era was the era of the priests. And now they think they've figured out who the gods are. Now they want to establish a relationship with the gods. And so they invent rituals and prayers of various kinds to try to talk to the gods and appease them. The third stage would be the prophets, the era of the prophets. And now there are people who are purporting to speak on behalf of a particular God. People like the Hebrew prophets, like Joel or Isaiah or Jeremiah, who say that they're speaking on behalf of God. Or Isaiah, that beautiful passage this morning, where Isaiah says to God, send me, I'll go. And so he's the prophet. And prophet is actually, it's a Greek word, prophete, which means to speak on behalf of. And I've said many times, the function of the prophet is not to prevent the future, is not to predict the future, but to prevent it. Not to foretell it, but to forestall it. Because the prophet is the one who's constantly calling us back into our covenanted relationship with God. So that would be the third stage. And then the fourth stage is the mystics. And I believe that the mystics don't speak about the God or to the gods or even on behalf of God. They speak as God because they realize there is only God and that every single one of us is a holographic fractal of source. We're bite-sized pieces of God. We're spirits in spaces. We're souls on safari on planet Earth, whatever phrase you want to give to it. So they realize that ultimately only God exists and we are holographic fractals of God. As I continue to wrestle with this notion of who God was for me, I had to figure out who God was not for me. And so firstly, I do not believe that God was this dysfunctional, abusive parent who threw Adam and Eve out of the garden for a sin they committed when they were pre-rational. I do not believe in that kind of a God. Nor do I believe in a God who is a cosmic psychopath who wiped out all of creation in a flood. And I talked about this cosmic psychopath in the last book I did, which was called Setting God Free, moving beyond the creation of our own imaginations and projection. So I don't believe that God is this cosmic psychopath who loses his cool every so often. Nor do I believe that God is partisan. I do not believe in the notion of a chosen race or one true religion. When the Catholic Church opines extra ecclesiam nulla est salus, outside the Catholic Church, there is no redemption. For me, that's absolute poppycock. Fourthly, I do not believe in a creator God. I don't believe that God goes into his workshop on a Monday morning and says, I wonder what I'm going to create today. And today he decides to make elephants, and tomorrow he decides to make mosquitoes, and then Wednesday he decides to make daffodils. I don't believe in that notion. So I don't believe in this creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. I believe rather with Plotinus, this great 2nd century philosopher who said he believed in emanatio ab Deo, emanation from God. So it's that everything that exists is actually a manifestation of the pre-existing divinity. It's not something coming out of a rabbit coming out of a hat. So I do not believe in a creator God. Nor do I believe in a God who is a lawmaker, a lawgiver, a law enforcer, or a law punisher. Now, there obviously are cosmic laws of the physical universe, like gravity. You jump out a 6-story window, you're going to break your leg or kill yourself. And so there are physical laws, obviously, but God is not making laws to trip us up or to test us. The universe is as the universe is, and we volunteer, to find who we really are in the middle of all that. Nor do I believe that God is a person, or certainly I don't believe that God is 3 persons. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. These are simply masks, that God wears in order to present different facets, or rather they're masks we've imposed upon God in order to articulate the various ways in which we've experienced God. And so since each one of us is a person, the only relationship we can have with God is a personal relationship. As I look around me, I'm living in the middle of the forest on a mountaintop. I have a personal relationship with this mountain and with this forest, but the forest is not a person. But I am a person, and therefore the only kind of relationship I can have with the forest and the mountain is a personal relationship. I'm a person, and therefore the only kind of relationship I can have with God is a personal relationship. But that does not make God a person in any way. So then we've got this extraordinary tug of war, where I believe that religion, which is necessary and which is very important, but it is merely the training wheels for spirituality. Once we finally reach a Gnostic, esoteric, experiential wisdom about God, religion takes on a very, very different meaning. It's just about community, and it's about, helping us in our search and challenging us in our belief systems. But it's merely a training wheel for spirituality, because eventually we're meant to morph into mysticism. And there's a huge difference between fundamentalism and mysticism. Very, very often, religion and many other systems, they regress into fundamentalism. And the essence of fundamentalism, I believe, is 4 steps. Fundamentalism, the first step is you reduce a very complex idea, like God, to just a few bumper stickers. And you put it on your bumper sticker, and you think the bumper sticker represents, all there is to be known about God. The same thing is true in politics or in economics or education or any one of these. reducing complex ideas to simplistic bumper stickers is the first line or the first phase of fundamentalism. The second stage always is you either identify or you fabricate an enemy figure. Now you've reduced complex ideas to very simplistic terms, and now you find an enemy figure or you create an enemy figure. The third stage is you dehumanize the enemy figure. And then fourthly, you begin to slaughter the enemy. They're always the four stages of a fundamentalism. Now, mysticism does exactly the opposite for that. Mysticism, the first stage of mysticism, is to move from cataphatic language to apophatic language. Instead of reducing God to a few theological one-liners, you realize that, cataphatic language is totally unable to express God. So you move into apophatic language, neti, Then the second stage is, instead of defining an enemy or fabricating an enemy, you realize that all people are your neighbor. The third stage is, instead of dehumanizing the other, you offer namaste to the other. You say, the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And then the fourth stage is, instead of the slaughter and the kind of the warfare, you reach out in unconditional love to the other, insofar as you can identify other. So that for me is, what I think about when I think who God is. The second question then is, who am I? Who do I regard myself? And for me, the best articulation of this is the Hindu model of the 7 different levels of body. So there's source, and there are the fractals of source we call souls. And then there's a psyche body, and then there's a mental body, and then there's the astral body, and then there's the etheric body, and finally there's the physical body. Now, very, very often, the physical body is what I think I am. I identify me as this with this skin-encapsulated ego. And obviously, I'm not that. That is kind of a mission I'm on, in order to see if I can still remember, in the absence of the evidence, that I am God and everybody else is God as well. And so resting with the question of who I am. Now, this question, or this reality making, goes through the following stages in our physical bodies. The first stage is we rely on our sensorium to give us input from the external world. And we act as if the external world is actually represented accurately by our sensorium. And obviously it's not. We're looking basically at electromagnetic waves based on Boolean algebra, and we're translating it into sensory information. So the second stage then is our perceptions. We literally cook the data presented by the senses, and from these perceptions, we create actual experiences. And then we archive these experiences, and we call it our memory bank. And from this memory bank, this creates our sense of self. And then finally, we create an idea of what the world is out there, and that becomes our reality model. And eventually then, when we live in community, we cross-fertilize these individual reality models, like the set theory in mathematics, the intersection set of all the other sets, and then that becomes the consensual reality model. And at that stage then, I begin to be identified with my spacesuit. I think I am my ego, or I believe I'm my emotions, or I'm my ideas, or I'm my profession, or I'm my relationships. So I identify then with these aspects, and I'm assigned cultural roles, particularly around age 7, when I develop the ability to think rationally. I'm immediately assigned roles and rules by society, and that becomes the I. And that's the problem with most of us. That is the I to which we still cling. So the third great question then would be, who is my neighbor? And obviously, when we use the word neighbor, it has a very long checkered history. So sometimes it bespeaks a kind of a special relationship. When you call somebody neighbor, it means you have some kind of a real important connection. Maybe after family, this becomes the next important connection or relationship. But it's based basically on a geographical proximity, not on so much on the quality of the connection itself. And that allows you then to kind of to make war and to rob people who are not the enemy, rivals, in neighboring kingdoms, or different parts of the country. And so the neighbor then becomes a way of just, gathering kind of friends, in the battle against those who are not my neighbor. Now you fast forward this, and there's this great question asked in Luke's gospel, where a scholar of the law asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And typical Jesus fashion, he's not going to give a theological answer to this or a philosophical diatribe. He talks in a parable. He says there was a certain man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was mugged and left for dead on the side of the road. And a priest from the temple was going down there, and he saw a fellow Jew, and he passed by on the other side of the road. For the priest to touch a dead body it was verboten. He couldn't go back into the temple without some kind of a purification rite. So he ignored the fellow Jew and kept going. Sometime later, a Levite went down, and the Levites were like the temple sacristans, and they were under the same injunction: you cannot touch a dead body. So he goes by as well. And then finally, a Samaritan, who were kind of the deadly enemies of the Israelites at the time, he's going by and he sees this Jew lying half dead on the side of the road. He attends to him. He pours wine into the wounds to cauterize them, puts him on his own donkey, takes him down to Jericho, checks into a hotel, looks after him for a few days, and then says to the innkeeper, I need to go off on business for a little bit. I want you to look after this man, and when I come back, I'll pick up the tab. And Jesus said, who is neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? And the question is very obvious. Now, this is a much, much deeper parable than we often realize, because firstly, the neighbor wasn't the fellow Jew, it was the enemy figure. And the journey of redemption starts in Jerusalem and ends in Jericho, where, in the year 1210 BCE, the Israelites had begun their conquest of the promised land in Jericho. They crossed the river Jordan at Jericho, laid waste to Jordan, and spent the next 200 years conquering the land. And now here's this guy reversing that trip, starting in Jerusalem and going all the way back to Jericho. And the neighbor is the enemy. And so in some senses, it's a spiritual campaign of compassion and inclusivity, not a military campaign of conquering. And so the real meaning of neighbor then is, there is only one life, there's only one body. So all of life, whether you're experiencing it in a pre-incarnational phase, or an incarnational phase, or a post-incarnational phase, or a reincarnational phase, there's only one life running through you and your history. Moreover, it is the same life that's running through all human beings, this one life, just different articulations. In fact, it's the same life that courses through all sentient being. Everything that exists, there's only one life. It is the life of God. And so in some senses, neighbor is the realization that there is only one of us. All sentient life forms are neighbors. And then the highest spiritual practice is to be able to see God in everything, the God who's really present. So then the final question I looked at was, what is my mission? And I suggest that there are two levels to a mission. The first level is an individual one, and the second level is a kind of a global one. And so each soul comes in volunteering to address both of these levels. So the first one then is to grow in love as an incarnated individual splink of the divine. So I realize that I'm a spark of the divine. I'm part of the Netzotzim, to use the kind of the Jewish mystical term, the spark of God, this kind of fractal, this holographic fractal of source. So I need to come to that realization myself. That's the first and most important part of my individual mission. And then the second part of the mission is to be part of the team that shifts the world into a Christ consciousness that allows it to re-experience and re-identify the Buddha nature of all that is. So they're the twin foci of the mission. Now, what kind of equipment do we come with? So we come with various kinds of equipment. We come with physicality, we come with emotionality, and we come with intellectuality. And these are meant to be tools in the kit of rediscovering who we are and what the purpose is. And even personality itself, there's this notion in psychology, this big debate for over 100 years in psychology, whether the personality is primarily driven by nature, that we're born in particular ways and we can't change, or it's driven by nurture, which means we're a blank slate, tabula rasa, and you can create anything you want out of it. And that's the nurture controversy. So it's this balance between nature and nurture. I believe there are only two parts of a three-part equation, and that the third part is by far the most important piece. So it's a combination of nature, nurture, and the soul that comes in. And I've said to you many times that you can put a young soul in a perfectly healthy body, in a loving family, and it'll screw up anyway. And you can put an old soul, in a retarded body, even mentally retarded body, in a dysfunctional family, and it will shine anyway. So the most important ingredient of personality is not nature or nurture, although they definitely contribute to the spacesuit. It is the soul that comes in. And then so you have a differentiation between old soul and young soul. And this has nothing got to do with chronology. It has to do with how I experienced my evolutionary trajectory or what I did with the missions, that I volunteered for. So we come then in the individual mission with two kinds of gifts. Our talents with which we're meant to serve the world, not to hoard or to inflate our ego. And so the talents are our gift to the world. We're like a mailman with a bunch of letters. The letters in your mailbag do not belong to you, even if the bag is yours. The letters belong to the people whose names are on the envelopes. Your talents do not belong to you. They belong to the world. You came to give them. And that's why I said, here I am, Lord, send me. I'll be your messenger. I'll carry a bag of letters to the world. And the second kind of gift we come with is our problems. And these are our gift to ourselves, because these are the guarantee, or at least they're the invitation to stretch out of present vicissitude into virtue. Now, unfortunately, mostly we tend to hoard our talents as if they belong to us and to project our problems as if they belong to somebody else. And that leads to the whole notion of karma. People think that karma is a punitive mechanism whereby I'm punished in subsequent incarnations for sins I committed in previous incarnations. It has nothing got to do with that. Karma is the realization that before you come in, you plan the hand you want to play in this lifetime. Who your parents are, who your friends are, whom you're going to find difficult, what era of human history you're going to parachute into, what part of the world you're going to come into. So you plan a hand and you're born, and that is your karma. It's not a punishment, you plan to do it. And so the real meaning of karma is that you should wake up and realize, oh my God, here's the situation I find myself in. Here's the political situation in our country right now. Here's the kind of the people that I have to live with now. How lucky am I? I actually landed in exactly the right spot, the one I volunteered to be. And that's the real meaning of karma. You're here because you choose to be here, and you choose to be here now. And that's what karma is. Now, destiny is when you play your cards as you were meant to play them. Destiny is what happens then. By the end of your incarnation, you fulfilled your mission. And now you're much, much closer to self-realization. Fate is what happens when you play your hand badly and you don't, welcome the situation in which you find yourself. You curse your luck, or you can't believe what happened. Then fate is what happens at the end of an incarnation. It's a wasted incarnation. So at the end of every incarnation, it will determine what kind of a new hand you want to play the next time you come around. And so ultimately then, the global mission is to discover your Buddha nature and to create Christ consciousness. It is to give birth to God. Namaste, brothers and sisters. So let's dig in and take some questions.
Yes, Seán, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the role of mind versus experience in mystical transformation. It seems like we learn with our minds, but they're also prejudiced by our egos and our perceptions and by that memory bank that we have. And you hear so many times that God isn't in the words, he's in the experience. And so they almost sometimes seem to be at odds with each other, but they can also help each other too.
That's a great question, Tom. And so I give two responses to it. The first one is to differentiate very importantly between brain and mind. So very, very often we think that the brain is the kind of the origin of consciousness, and that consciousness is an epiphenomenon from neurological activity in the physical brain. And that's not true at all. The brain is just an artifact of consciousness. Consciousness is primary. So we have to make the first distinction is to not mess up the brain and the mind. The brain is anterior to, the mind is anterior to the physical brain. So that's the first differentiation. The second differentiation is to differentiate between, wisdom and knowledge. And so knowledge is data generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data which is generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And so there's lots of different faculties at play here. Now, in the middle of all that, how do we differentiate between mentation, or on the one hand, and experiences on the other hand? So the image I give sometimes is like our sensorium are like a hunter-gatherer out looking for berries or for animals. So it's looking to pick up data in various ways. Then once it's made the kill or found the berries, you come home and you cook them. And that's processing. So processing is cooking the data, in the best sense of the word, cooking the data. And then thirdly, you now have a kind of an experience. And that's like, now you're tasting the food. So you now have an experience of tasting the food. Now, you're going to build up a memory bank then, and there'll be some food you look at and say, I know, I didn't like that, I don't want that. And so now you have a memory, a series of retrieved experiences. Now, the problem with memory is this. There's two parts to memory. Even in the physical brain, there's the hippocampus and there's the amygdala. The hippocampus is the area of the brain, and there's one in each side. The hippocampus is what stores the raw data, the facts of an experience. The amygdala is what stores the emotional associations to the data. And so, for instance, if I'm, suppose, God forbid, that I'm, driving along my road, which collapsed last week. I was stuck here for about a week. My road collapsed. My dirt road collapsed. And so for a week, I can't get out of my home, and I'm 10 miles from the nearest town. So, now I'm able to get through. So I drive through that one patch, and it's really, really narrow, and it's really, really muddy. And so I remember the data. I remember when I arrived there, and the road was gone, and what the experience was. And I have some kind of emotional kind of reaction to that reality. Now, if there were damage to my hippocampus for some reason, every time I reached that part of the road, I'd be freaking out. But I have no idea why I'm freaking out, because I have no recall over the data. If, on the other hand, what got damaged was my my amygdala, but the hippocampus was fine, I'd come to that place and I remember all the details, but I would have no emotional attachment. So now we're differentiating again, even within memory. So then when I recall memories of various kinds, I've got those problems. To compound things is every time you retrieve a memory, you damage it a little bit, you change it a little bit, because the context in which you're retrieving it is slightly different. It's like an old photograph that you keep taking out of the drawer and handling, and now it's full of sweat, and so it's becoming discolored because of its frequent retrieval. The other problem is, if you leave it in a drawer and never take it out at all, it never sees sunshine. If you do take it out eventually, it's all faded. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. If you don't retrieve memories frequently enough, it's going to fade. If you do, you're going to change it. And you remember, if you have siblings and you go back to a childhood event, your memory is very, very different from the others. Though in the middle of that, all that maelstrom, how are we meant to kind of somehow elevate and find God? Now, at that stage, we're using very different faculties. We're using then what Carl Jung defined intuition as perception via the unconscious. So we are not just absorbing data through our sensorium. We're souls on safari, and therefore there are many other conduits into your soul than merely your sensorium. And so it becomes very important then, what are the kind of what are the practices that put you in frequent contact with those particular streams of data? And obviously it's stuff like meditation, time spent in nature, time watching little children at play, Eucharist, if it's really done. Anything that creates an altered state of consciousness for you is going to deliver very different streams of data for you. And I use the example many times, I'd use it during the retreat, of visiting a high-rise in a dream I had, many, many different floors with different rooms in each floor. And each room contained just a portion of a mural. And each room contained a portion of a mural, and each floor contained a very, very different version of it, in the sense that we went from, stick figure drawings to realistic drawings to colored drawings to three-dimensional drawings to interactive three-dimensional holographic drawings. And so we have to be able to access all of the rooms and all of the floors. And that's how we're drinking in the data that leads to wisdom, rather than just merely drinking in the data that leads to knowledge. So practices that allow us to open up to those different channels is the way in which we can then have mystical experiences. It is our birthright. We were born to have these kinds of experiences, but we've been indoctrinated in a particular way, that only data that comes through the sensorium and is checked by our scientific equipment, only that is real. And then it becomes really, really difficult, to experience that which the culture tells you is not real. Even if you're having other experiences, either you're afraid to talk about it because you're going to get locked up and they tell you you're crazy, or nobody will support it. And so we have to have the courage to visit all of these different floors and all of these different rooms on each floor. There are many, many, many channels where the data of God's love are flowing into the human heart. And on the basis of that, you're going to have Gnostic, mystical experiences that can't be delivered from merely, reading a book or using kind of our sensorium.
I've had a really, really hard month. And it's like everything I tried to do right went wrong. And I just, realized it's like I've had 2 dream images that I have over and over. And one of them was I'm trying to go through this revolving door into to the lobby of some kind. I'm not sure what was behind the lobby, but that wasn't the issue. The thing was, I kept missing where to get off, and I kept ending up back where I started. And then after feeling like persecuted by, I'm not sure what, astrology possibly, I felt like, okay, we're not getting anywhere. I mean, I've gone through this over and over, and it's getting worse and worse. And then I have another dream image that comes up often. I'm living in the top floor of a very tall building, and the wind is waving it. And I'm trying to feel secure, like I should feel okay about this. So I'm forcing myself to feel okay in this very insecure situation. And I think probably only about a day ago, I realized, oh, I've got to totally change this. I better pay attention the next time I get in the revolving door, because it's like it's a habit of being afraid to get out of the loop.
You solved your own problem right there, Marty. So let me respond to it. So I obviously don't have time to go into individual dreams on a situation like this, but I'll just say one thing very, very briefly, that there are archetypes that appear in our dreams. There are 2 kinds of archetypal imagery. The first one is where it's if I dream of a mountaintop, that's archetypal in the sense that a mountaintop represents a theophany, a connection to the heavens. So everybody, has archetypal dreams. So now there's they can be unpacked by an expert who knows the kind of archetypal significance of any particular sign in a dream. But then there's associative symbolism, which is peculiar to the dreamer. So for instance, if you dream of Mount Kilimanjaro, and I dream of Mount Kilimanjaro, then, the archetype of the mountains is the same for both of us, but I lived near Mount Kilimanjaro, so I have a very personal kind of relationship with it. You probably did not live near Mount Kilimanjaro, so I'll have an associative symbolism to it, which is different from your association of it. I don't know what your association is, but you obviously do. You've heard the name. And so we have to realize then that, when only you can figure out what the associative symbolism of any dream element is. But I can tell you as a psychologist what the archetypal associations are. And so in psychology, and indeed in many spiritual systems, the house is the archetype of the psyche, the entire psyche. And so if I dream of being in a situation where there's a revolving door, I seem to be going nowhere, somehow this is a reflection that it may be that in my waking consciousness, I have a feeling I'm not get any place. I've, encountered this situation before, I tried to deal with it. I don't seem to be any better off than I was. And so it'll keep presenting itself until there's a total shift in consciousness. And I realize maybe the ways in which I've been dealing with, have been inadequate. Maybe I need a radically different kind of an approach. And the second part of your dream is you're at the top of a huge skyscraper. Now, in a dream, various parts of the home represent different facets of the psyche. So if I dream about being in the kind of in the basement of my home, it represents the unconscious. If I dream, for instance, about the living room, it has to do with my emotional life. If I dream about, windows, they're my connection to the outdoors, but they're protecting me. My door represents the fact that I can create a boundary, but it's a boundary that I can open and close and allow in whom I will, and keep out whom I don't want to come. But the roof of the building always represents the intellectual life. And so, for instance, if there's fear at that stage, it might mean that intellectually, that you have some fears about your models. And so it's an invitation to look at the house as a symbol of the psyche and figure out, are you stuck in some kind of a loop, in waking consciousness that you need to change? And is there some level of your thinking that's actually making you feel dizzy or afraid of a collapse? So maybe just work with those images.
my question is about, so if it's one of our kind of jobs or purposes to figure out what our mission is and then to execute that in life, I guess my question is around, is it always the case that there are going to be roadblocks to getting there, i.e. it feels difficult to take those steps and make those decisions? So is it always typically difficult, but you still have kind of a bit of a knowing? Is that kind of typically the case? And then how would you address that?
Part of the problem is, we come from, most of us probably from Christian backgrounds, where we feel somehow that this is a veil of tears, that God has kind of put roadblocks in our way to test us, or because he's in a bad humor or whatever. I believe, I've said many times, that when we come into life, we make preconception contracts with a group of souls to appear on the planet at roughly the same parents and grandparents, obviously. So it's not strictly chronological, but we're going to encounter a particular group of people whom we contracted to be a part of their life and of our life. Now, when we come in, we have a full kaleidoscopic understanding of the entire sweep of human history. We're looking at the matrix of all possible futures, because there is no future in the sense there's just the perennial now. And so we're choosing a particular stream, that has particular historical events associated to it, and we parachute into that particular situation. But all we know when we come in is, I know my own personal history, my own track record of previous incarnations. I know what I'm good at, I know what is to learn. And I know the histories of all of the other players. I know exactly the world situation into which I'm parachuting. But having said that, there is no plot going forward, and there is no script going forward. We're in psychodrama, or we're in improv theatre. And I told you many times, I had a client one time who was a professional actor. And he told me there are 2 rules to improv theatre. The first rule is, you can't reject a line that your partner on stage gives you. Whatever he says on stage, you have to work with that. You can't say, that's a dumb line, give me a different one. I find it very hard to work with that line. You have to work with whatever line he gives you. And the second one is, you've got to try and offer lines to her that are going to make her look good. You know what her strengths are. You're going to play to her strengths. And if you do that and she does that, then the play is going to be really, really good. If I try my line to trip you up, the entire play is going to fall in his face. And then what am I going to do? And so we're in improv theatre. There's an initial circumstance into which we parachuted, knowing exactly what the circumstance was, what the challenges were, what the resources were. We know the track history of everybody in the drama and our own track history. And on the basis of that, now we have to kind of respond to what life throws us. So it's not that God is throwing up obstacles. It's that we've volunteered to be in a situation in which, this is probably what's going to go down. Now the question becomes, how do I harvest that? It's not a question of it being good or bad. Shakespeare said very famously, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. These are categories we foist on our experiences in order to avoid having to deal with them. So Rumi would say, out beyond the ideas of right doing and beyond wrongdoing, there is a field. I'd meet you there. So there's a place beyond logic and beyond categorizing events or people. And there's the big difference that Jesus teaches us when he says, do not judge and you will not be judged. So does that mean that you have to kind of go through life blandly? No, he's not saying that. But there's a huge difference between judgment and evaluation. Judgment is ascribing ontological value to a person or to an event. He's a bad person, or that's an unlucky circumstance. That's judgment. Evaluation is determining the appropriate response to a person or to a situation. They're vastly different. So improv theatre is about evaluating the situation and responding lovingly to it, where a judgment is about pigeonholing it. So there's no sense in which God is trying to trip us up or even test us. We are testing ourselves because we volunteered to come into a period of human history with a particular group of people in order to afford every single person the ideal circumstance to do the kind of growing they want to grow in this incarnation. For one person, the focus of incarnation might be on developing courage. For another person, it's compassion. For another person, it's patience. For another person, it's resilience. For another person, it's forgiveness. We have no idea what the mission of the other person is at an individual level. So we have to just, whatever it is, I have to mine every circumstance and every relationship for that possibility. There's nothing got to do with God trying to trip us up. Great question, then.
Seán, could you talk more about the hippocampus and the amygdala and how we get the information to be not just one or the other, but also how we can mine that for dealing with the unconscious beliefs that drive so much of our behavior?
Okay. So we actually have two hippocampi and two amygdalas, one on each side of the right brain and one on the left brain. And they provide complementary functions. In fact, there's a really interesting book. It was mentioned during the retreat by Jill Bolte Taylor. This was an extraordinary woman, a neurologist, who suffered a stroke in her left hemisphere. But somehow she got catapulted into her right hemisphere, and she had these extraordinary mystical experiences. Now, it took her about 10 years to recover fully her left hemisphere, and she had to learn how to walk again and how to talk again. But meantime, she's having these extraordinary mystical experiences. So she created a model, 4 components, looking at what the amygdala on the left does, what the hippocampus on the left does, what the amygdala on the right side does, and what the hippocampus on the right does. And so basically, left to their own devices, the hippocampus is like, what was the famous detective that used to say, just give me the facts, ma'am, just the facts? Some detective, some TV detective. So the hippocampus is only interested in the facts, whereas the amygdala is interested in the emotional associations to these tasks. But one is based in the logical brain and the other is based in the kind of the creative brain. So now you get these 4 pieces talking to each other. And my understanding is, I haven't read the book, I just heard about it this week during the retreat, that she's developed a whole technique and a practice of making teams. She actually gives each one of these a name, a specific name, and she addresses them in any one life situation. She shows you how to access, each of them sequentially, so as to kind of build up an overall picture. So it reminds me of, there's a branch of psychology which was developed about 1900 by an Italian psychiatrist called Roberto Seggioli, and it's called Psychosynthesis. And he believed that the personality is composed of many, many different sub-personalities, not in the sense of multiple personality disorder. Multiple personality disorder is where one personality takes over and you believe that that's who you are. Psychosynthesis is the realization that there are many facets to the psyche. And so, for instance, your alarm clock goes off in the morning and you wake up and you're really, really tired. And one voice says to you, stay in bed, and you're really knackered. You didn't get enough sleep last night. Go back to sleep, turn off the alarm clock already. And the other part says, buddy, you got a job to do. There are children who, you need to make their breakfast, or you got a job to go. Get your ass out of bed. And so there's at least these 2 voices. So, but there are actually multiple voices. And what he recommended, the same thing, was that you identify each of these sub-personalities and you give them a name and a role. And I've used this a lot in my psychology practice, where I'll say to people, each one of these parts loves you, but they've got a really narrow focus about, what you need to do. And the example I use is, imagine a government in which there's a minister for education, and there's a minister for agriculture, and there's a minister for defense, and there's a minister for health. And each one of these guys loves the country, but every one of them thinks that their portfolio is the most important. So the guy in charge of defense says, if you can't defend your country, what's the point? You don't want to have a food source eventually. So most of the money needs to come to me. The agricultural guy says, no. Food is what's important. If people don't have food, how are they going to even join an army? The education woman says, it's not about that. If you don't educate people, they don't know how to grow crops, they don't know how to handle themselves. So education is primarily important. And the Minister for Health says, no. If people don't have their health, they have nothing. So each of them loves the country, but each one wants the vast bulk of the money to go to their particular portfolio. And the function of the president of the country, or in Ireland we would call it the Taoiseach, is to kind of listen to all of the ministers and then make the decision. We're going to provide this much, money for this portfolio and this much for that. So that's what Psychosynthesis did. I haven't read Jill Bolter's book, but I imagine she's assigning different functions to these 4 elements, the 2 hippocampi and the 2 amygdalae. And so I think it might be well worth getting that book, Linda, and scrolling through it, because my understanding is that it's not just a theoretical treatise, but it's actually a practical manual for how you actually engage these pieces.